Imagine you're holding a glass of water, not a heavy glass, just a simple one. You can hold it for a minute, no problem, maybe even 5 minutes. At first, it barely registers as effort. Your muscles are relaxed, your mind is elsewhere, and the glass is just there. But something subtle begins to change the longer you hold it. Not in the glass, it hasn't gained any weight, but in you. After 10 minutes, your arm starts to feel slightly uncomfortable. After 30, there's tension. After an hour, it begins to ache in a way that feels disproportionate to what you're holding. And if you were somehow forced to hold it all day, your entire body would start to react, your posture shifts, your focus narrows, irritation builds, and eventually the simplest task becomes exhausting. Now here's the strange part: the weight of the glass never changed. The only thing that changed was how long you carried it. Grief behaves in a similar way, but instead of your arm, it's your entire nervous system doing the holding. At the beginning, grief doesn't always feel like what people expect. It's not always dramatic or overwhelming. Sometimes it's quiet, almost invisible. A slight tension in the chest, a thought that doesn't quite settle, a feeling that something is off, but hard to name. Just like the glass, it can seem manageable at first, something you can carry while continuing with your day. But time transforms the experience. The longer the brain holds onto the reality of loss, the longer it tries to process something that doesn't fit, the heavier it becomes. Not because the event itself is changing, but because your system is continuously engaging with it. The mind revisits it. The body responds to it. The same internal weight is being held again and again without rest, and unlike a physical object, you can't simply put grief down. You can distract yourself temporarily. You can focus on other things, shift your attention, fill your environment with noise or activity. But somewhere in the background, the system is still holding it. The brain is still trying to make sense of it. The body is still reacting to it in subtle ways. This is what makes grief confusing. From the outside, nothing seems to be happening. There's no visible object, no clear action, no obvious cause for the fatigue or heaviness. But internally, the system is under continuous load. It's like running a program in the background of a computer. You may not see it on the screen, but it's consuming memory, using processing power, generating heat. Over time, the system slows down, not because of anything visible, but because of what's quietly running underneath. Grief is that background process. And here's where it becomes even more interesting. Your brain doesn't treat this as optional. It doesn't say, "This is too heavy, let's stop." Instead, it keeps engaging with the loss over and over, because from its perspective, something important is unresolved. In physics, we often think in terms of forces and resistance. If you apply a constant force over time, even something small can produce significant strain. Grief is like a low, constant force applied to your internal system, not sharp enough to break you instantly, but persistent enough to reshape how you feel, think, and function. So when people say grief feels heavy, they're not being metaphorical in a loose sense. They're describing something very real, a continuous internal effort, sustained over time without a clear way to release it. And just like holding that glass, the question isn't only how heavy is it? The real question is, how long has your system been trying to carry it? Your brain is not a passive recorder of reality. It does not simply sit there, collecting information like a camera. Instead, it behaves more like a scientist running constant experiments. At every moment, it is making quiet predictions about what is going to happen next, and then comparing those predictions to what actually happens. You expect familiar sounds to occur at certain times. You expect certain people to be reachable. You expect routines to continue, messages to arrive, voices to respond. These expectations are not conscious most of the time. They operate in the background, automatically, like a system that has learned the patterns of your world so well that it no longer needs to think about them. Now imagine that one of those deeply learned patterns suddenly breaks. A person who has always been part of your world is no longer there. But your brain does not immediately update its model. It continues to generate the same predictions as before. It still expects the phone to light up with their name. It still anticipates their presence in familiar places. It still prepares responses to conversations that will never occur, and each time reality fails to match that expectation, something important happens inside the brain. There is a mismatch between what was predicted and what actually occurred. In neuroscience, this mismatch is called a prediction error. Under normal conditions, prediction errors are small and useful. They help the brain learn. If you expect something slightly wrong, the error signal nudges your brain to update its model, improving future predictions. But grief is not a small error. It is a massive, repeated violation of expectation. And it doesn't happen once. It happens again and again, every time the brain reaches for that person and finds nothing there. Think of it like a navigation system that still believes a road exists. Every time it tries to guide you through that road, it runs into a dead end. At first, it attempts to correct itself. But if the map is deeply ingrained, it keeps returning to the same road, producing the same error. Your brain is doing something similar. It keeps referencing an internal map that includes someone who is no longer present in the external world. This is why grief can feel so disorienting. It's not just that something is missing. It's that your internal model of reality is out of sync with reality itself. And that mismatch creates instability. What's even more interesting is that the brain doesn't instantly delete the outdated model. From a computational perspective, that would be risky. Sudden, large-scale changes could lead to more errors, not fewer. So instead, the brain updates slowly. It tests the new reality again and again, accumulating evidence that the prediction is no longer valid. Each failed expectation is a data point. But this process takes time because the original model wasn't built in a day. It was constructed over months or years of repeated interactions, shared experiences, and consistent patterns. The stronger the pattern, the harder it is to overwrite. This is why certain moments trigger grief more intensely. Walking into a familiar room, hearing a particular sound, reaching for your phone at a specific time. These are points where the brain's predictions are especially strong, and therefore where the errors feel most pronounced. And here's the subtle part. The brain is not trying to hurt you. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do: predict, compare, update. The pain is not the goal. It's a byproduct of a system attempting to reconcile two conflicting versions of reality. One version says this person exists, they are part of your world, they will continue to be present. The other version says they are gone. Grief lives in the space between those two models. It is the process of the brain slowly, reluctantly, and often painfully learning which version is true. People often say grief feels like physical pain, and it's tempting to treat that as a metaphor, just a way of describing something emotional using the language of the body. But when you look more closely at how the brain works, the line between emotional and physical begins to blur in a very literal way. Inside the brain, there isn't a clean separation between systems that process social experiences and systems that process bodily harm. Some of the same regions that become active when you touch a hot surface or injure a muscle also become active when you experience social loss. One of these regions, often discussed in neuroscience, is involved in detecting conflict, discomfort, and distress, regardless of whether the source is physical or relational. From the brain's perspective, losing a person who was deeply integrated into your life is not categorized as a minor event. It resembles a kind of functional injury. Not an injury to tissue or bone, but to the structure of your internal world. The brain had mapped that person into its expectations, its routines, even its regulation of emotion. When that person is gone, the system registers a disruption, and when disruption crosses a certain threshold, the body responds. Your chest tightens, not because something is physically compressing it, but because the muscles around your ribcage contract under stress signals. Your breathing becomes shallow or irregular. Your heart rate may increase or feel uneven. These are not imagined sensations. They are measurable changes in physiology triggered by neural activity that is interpreting loss as a significant threat or imbalance. Think of it like an alarm system that doesn't distinguish perfectly between different types of danger. If a window breaks, the alarm goes off. If a door is forced open, the alarm goes off. And if something deeply important disappears from your environment, something the system relied on, The alarm can activate in a similar way. The body prepares itself for action, but here's where it becomes complicated. In a typical physical threat, there is something you can do. You can move away, defend yourself, change the situation. The activation has a direction. It resolves. In grief, there is no clear action that resolves the problem. The body is activated, but there is nowhere for that energy to go. No external event can reverse what has happened, so the activation lingers. It cycles, it rises and falls, but doesn't fully discharge. This can create a sensation of pressure, especially in areas like the chest and throat. These are regions closely tied to breathing and vocalization, systems that are deeply connected to emotional expression. When those systems are constrained, either by tension or by the absence of expression, the feeling can intensify. There's also an interesting overlap with how the brain processes attachment. Human beings are not designed to operate in isolation. Over time, close relationships become integrated into how we regulate stress, how we feel safe, even how we interpret the world. Another person's presence can lower your heart rate, stabilize your breathing, and reduce stress hormone levels. When that regulatory presence disappears, the body doesn't instantly compensate. It has to recalibrate. And during that recalibration, the system can become unstable. So the pain of grief is not just about missing someone in an abstract sense. It is the body reacting to the sudden absence of a stabilizing element it had adapted to rely on. This is why the pain can feel so specific and so localized. A tightness in the chest, a heaviness behind the eyes, a constriction in the throat. These are not random sensations. They are the physical signatures of a system trying to adjust to a loss it does not yet fully understand. And perhaps the most striking part is this: even though nothing is visibly broken, the body behaves as if something important has been damaged. Because, in its own way, something has. Now shift your attention from structure to chemistry, because beneath all of these sensations, tightness in the chest, fatigue, restlessness, there is a layer of invisible activity unfolding in the body. Signals are being sent, hormones are being released, and entire systems are adjusting their behavior in response to what the brain has interpreted as a significant disruption. One of the central players in this process is something called the stress response system. It involves a network connecting the brain and body, often referred to as the HPA axis, short for the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal glands. You don't need to remember the names. What matters is what it does. It acts like a communication loop. When the brain detects something important, especially something threatening or destabilizing, it sends a signal down this chain. The end result is the release of stress hormones, particularly cortisol. Cortisol is not a bad chemical. In fact, it's essential. If you suddenly need to react, run, focus, respond quickly. Cortisol helps mobilize energy, sharpen attention, and prepare the body for action. It's part of what keeps you alive in urgent situations. But grief is not an urgent situation in the usual sense. It doesn't come and go quickly. It lingers. So instead of a brief spike in cortisol that rises and then falls, what often happens is something quieter and more persistent. Cortisol levels remain slightly elevated over long periods of time. Not dramatically high, not enough to feel like panic, but enough to shift the baseline of how your body operates. This creates what you might think of as a kind of background stress. It's not always conscious. You might not wake up thinking, "I am stressed." But your body behaves as if something unresolved is still present. Over time, this has subtle but real effects. Your immune system, for example, becomes less efficient. Cortisol in prolonged doses can suppress certain immune responses. This means your body may become slightly more vulnerable to illness or slower to recover. It's not immediate or obvious, but it's measurable. Sleep is another system that gets disrupted. Cortisol follows a natural daily rhythm. It's supposed to rise in the morning and fall at night. But when the stress system is activated for long periods, that rhythm can become irregular. You might find it harder to fall asleep, or you might wake up in the middle of the night with a sense of alertness that doesn't match your surroundings. Appetite can shift as well. Some people feel a reduced desire to eat, as if the body is conserving energy or losing interest in routine behaviors. Others experience the opposite. using food as a way to stabilize fluctuations in energy and mood. Both patterns are different expressions of the same underlying system trying to find balance. There are also changes in how the heart behaves. The heart does not beat with perfect regularity, it naturally varies in timing, and this variability is actually a sign of a flexible, adaptive system. Under prolonged stress, that variability often decreases. The system becomes more rigid, less responsive, as if it is locked into a narrower range of behavior. None of these changes are dramatic on their own. There is no single moment where something clearly breaks. Instead, it's more like a machine that continues to run, but slightly out of alignment. Everything still functions, but with less efficiency, less flexibility, and more strain. What makes this difficult to notice is that these changes happen gradually. You adapt to them as they occur. The new baseline begins to feel normal, even though it is different from where you started. And yet, all of this is being driven by something that has no physical form. There is no external object causing these changes. There is no visible threat. The entire cascade begins with a shift in how the brain interprets reality, a recognition of loss that it has not yet fully resolved. From a biological perspective, this is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. It detects a significant disruption, activates protective mechanisms, and tries to maintain stability under new conditions. But grief places the system in a strange position. The disruption cannot be reversed. The threat cannot be eliminated. So the system remains active, not because it is malfunctioning, but because it has no clear signal that the situation has been resolved. And so the chemistry continues, quietly shaping how the body feels, how it heals, and how it moves through time. There is another layer to this process that is even less visible. But just as important, it has to do with how the body interprets threat, not in a conscious logical sense, but in a deeply embedded, biological way that was shaped long before modern life existed. If you could step back and look at the human body as a system designed over thousands of generations, you would notice something interesting. It does not make a strong distinction between physical danger and social danger. To the system, both can be equally serious. For most of human history, survival did not depend on individuals acting alone. It depended on belonging to a group. Being connected to others meant access to food, protection from threats, shared knowledge, and support during injury or illness. Losing a close bond was not just emotionally difficult. It could directly reduce your chances of survival. So the body evolved to treat certain kinds of social loss as a signal that something is wrong at a fundamental level. When that signal appears, the body prepares itself. One of the ways it does this is through inflammation. You can think of inflammation as a general purpose defense mechanism. When the body detects injury or infection, it increases blood flow to certain areas, releases signaling molecules, and mobilizes immune cells. This helps isolate damage, fight off threats, and begin repair. But here's the strange part during periods of grief. Markers of inflammation in the body often increase even when there is no physical injury. It's as if the body is preparing to deal with a wound that it cannot locate. This is not a mistake in the usual sense. It's a byproduct of a system that evolved to respond quickly to danger, even if the signals are sometimes ambiguous. If losing social connection historically increased the likelihood of physical harm, being exposed, unsupported, or vulnerable, then preparing the body for potential injury would have been a useful strategy. In the modern world, that same response can feel confusing. There is no visible threat, no external enemy, no wound to treat, and yet the body behaves as if it is under pressure. You might feel a general sense of heaviness or fatigue, not tied to any specific activity. Small aches may appear without a clear cause. Your energy levels fluctuate in ways that don't seem predictable. These are subtle expressions of a system that is slightly elevated, slightly on edge, maintaining a state of readiness. It's important to understand that this state is not meant to be permanent. In a typical scenario, inflammation rises, addresses a problem, and then subsides. But grief doesn't present a clear endpoint. There is no moment when the body can definitively say, the threat is gone, we can return to baseline. So the system can remain partially activated, not at full intensity, but enough to influence how you feel from day to day. There's also an interaction between this inflammatory state and the brain. The same signaling molecules involved in inflammation can affect mood, energy, and motivation. They can alter how the brain processes information, often making everything feel slower, heavier, or more effortful. This creates a feedback loop. The brain interprets loss, the body responds with stress and inflammation, and those bodily signals feed back into the brain, shaping how the experience is felt. From the outside, it can look like nothing is happening. There is no visible injury, no clear malfunction. But internally, multiple systems are adjusting at once, each responding to signals that were designed for a different kind of world. And that's one of the most difficult aspects to grasp. The body is not reacting to what is visible. It is reacting to what is missing. Something that was once part of your environment, something the system relied on, is no longer there, and the absence itself becomes a signal. In physics, we often focus on forces that are present, things you can measure directly. But sometimes the absence of a force can be just as important. Remove a support and a structure changes. Remove a stabilizing element and the system has to redistribute its internal balance. Grief is like that. It is the body responding not to what has appeared, but to what has disappeared, and trying in its own way to adjust to a world that no longer matches the one it was built to expect. There is another effect of grief that is harder to point to because it doesn't show up in a blood test or a scan as clearly as hormones or inflammation. It shows up in how you experience time itself. Under ordinary conditions, time feels smooth and continuous. One moment leads to the next in a predictable way. Minutes feel like minutes. Days feel like days. You don't usually question it. It's just the background structure of experience. But during grief, something unusual happens. That structure begins to shift. A single day can feel stretched as if it contains more weight than it should. Simple tasks take longer. Not because they are objectively more difficult, but because your attention is divided. Part of your mind is engaged with the present moment, while another part is pulled toward memories, expectations, or the absence itself. This creates a kind of internal friction, and that friction changes how time is perceived. At the same time, the past can feel strangely close. Events that happened years ago may appear with a level of clarity and intensity that makes them feel recent. A conversation, a sound, a small detail, these can re-emerge with surprising vividness as if they were never fully stored away. This distortion is not random. It has to do with how the brain encodes and retrieves information. The brain does not record time directly. It infers time based on the density of experiences and the emotional intensity attached to them. When something is emotionally significant, the brain allocates more resources to processing it. More detail is captured, more associations are formed, and the memory becomes richer. Grief is an emotionally dense state. Even when nothing outwardly significant is happening, the internal experience is intense. Thoughts loop, sensations fluctuate, meaning is constantly being evaluated. From the brain's perspective, a lot is happening, even if the external world appears quiet. This creates the sensation that time is slowing down, not because the clock has changed, but because your internal processing has expanded. You can think of it like this: if you were to record a video at a higher frame rate, capturing more frames per second, and then play it back at a normal speed, everything would appear slower and more detailed. In a loose sense, grief increases the frame rate of internal experience. More is being processed per unit of time, so each moment feels longer. But there is another side to this. While the present moment can feel stretched, larger spans of time can collapse. Weeks or months may pass in a way that feels compressed or difficult to recall. You might look back and feel as if time has slipped by without a clear structure. This happens because attention is not evenly distributed. The brain is prioritizing certain kinds of processing, often related to the loss, while other experiences receive less encoding. As a result, those periods contain fewer detailed memories, and when you look back on them, they feel shorter or less defined. So you end up with a paradox. Moments feel long, but months feel short. The present feels heavy, but the past feels fragmented. And underlying all of this is the same mechanism. The brain is trying to reorganize its model of reality, and that process requires attention, energy, and time. But in doing so, it alters the very thing it relies on to measure change. This is one of the reasons grief can feel disorienting. It's not just that your emotions are shifting, it's that the framework you use to understand experience, time itself, is behaving differently. And yet, from a biological perspective, this is not a malfunction. It's a consequence of how the brain prioritizes information. When something deeply significant changes, the system reallocates its resources. It focuses on what matters most, even if that comes at the cost of normal perception. So when people say that time feels strange during grief, they are not speaking loosely. They are describing a real alteration in how the brain processes and organizes experience. It is the mind in a very literal sense, taking more time to understand what has happened, even as time itself becomes harder to recognize. Another pattern begins to appear once you notice how the mind behaves over longer stretches of grief. It has a tendency to return to the same moments, the same conversations, the same fragments of the past, as if it is circling around something it cannot quite resolve. You might find yourself replaying a specific memory in precise detail. Not just what happened, but how it happened, the tone of a voice, the timing of a pause, something you said, something you didn't say. Then the mind shifts slightly and runs a variation of the same scene. What if you had responded differently? What if something had been noticed earlier? What if the outcome had changed? From the inside, this can feel almost involuntary, like a loop that starts on its own. And the question naturally arises, why does the brain keep doing this? Especially when it doesn't seem to lead to any clear answer. To understand this, it helps to think about what the brain is designed to do when something significant occurs. It tries to build a model that explains the event in a way that can guide future behavior. If something goes wrong, the system searches for patterns, causes, and possible interventions. It asks, in effect, what happened and how can this be predicted or prevented next time? In many everyday situations, this process works well. You make a small mistake, the brain analyzes it, extracts a lesson, and updates its expectations. The loop closes, the system stabilizes, but grief presents a very different kind of problem. Often, there is no clear action that could have changed the outcome, or if there was, it is buried under layers of uncertainty, complexity, and incomplete information. The brain searches for a clean explanation, a single point where a different choice would have led to a different result. But reality does not always provide that, so the process does not resolve. Instead, the brain continues to generate variations, testing different scenarios against the past, looking for consistency. Each replay is like a simulation. It takes the known elements and adjusts them slightly, trying to see if a different configuration would produce a different ending. In computational terms, it's an optimization problem with no clear solution. And because there is no definitive answer, the system does not receive the signal it needs to stop searching. This is why the loops can feel persistent. They are not simply memories resurfacing at random. They are active attempts by the brain to reduce uncertainty. Each repetition is an effort to make sense of something that resists simple explanation. There is also an emotional component to this process. Memories associated with strong attachment carry more weight in the system. They are more deeply encoded, more richly connected to other parts of your internal model. When those memories are activated, they bring with them not just information, but the emotional context in which they were formed. This amplifies the experience. A single memory can trigger a cascade of associated thoughts and sensations, pulling the system further into the loop. What makes this particularly challenging is that the brain is using a strategy that is normally useful. Simulation, repetition, and analysis are how it learns and adapts, but in this case, the strategy encounters a limit. There is no complete model that can fully account for the loss in a way that restores the previous state. So the loops continue, not because the brain is failing, but because it is applying a familiar process to an unfamiliar kind of problem. Over time, something gradual can begin to happen. Not a sudden resolution, but a slow reduction in the intensity and frequency of these loops. The brain accumulates enough evidence to shift its focus. The unanswered questions remain, but they lose some of their urgency. The simulations become less detailed, less frequent. The system begins to allocate its resources elsewhere. But the capacity for those loops does not disappear entirely. Under certain conditions, a familiar place, a particular date, an unexpected reminder, they can reappear, sometimes with surprising clarity. This suggests that the underlying structure of those memories remains intact. What changes is not their existence, but how often and how strongly the brain chooses to engage with them. So the repetition you experience during grief is not meaningless. It is the mind attempting again and again to close a loop that may not have a clean ending. And in doing so, it reveals something important about how the brain works. It is not satisfied with gaps in understanding. It will return to them repeatedly until it either finds an answer or learns, slowly and imperfectly, how to live without one. Even with all of these mechanisms, the physiological stress responses, the inflammatory signals, the looping memories, and the distorted sense of time, there remains a profound mystery about grief that science has not fully unraveled. We can measure the hormones, observe the brain regions, track heart rate and sleep patterns, and quantify inflammation. We can even document behavioral changes such as withdrawal or changes in appetite. But all of these measurements, as precise as they may be, capture only the surface. They tell us what the body and brain are doing, but they cannot fully explain what it feels like to lose someone, or why that experience varies so dramatically from person to person. Some people seem to navigate grief with less visible distress. Others experience it in waves that overwhelm daily functioning. The same objective event, a death, a separation, a loss, can trigger dramatically different responses in different people. This raises questions that go beyond biology. What determines the intensity of grief? How do previous experiences, personality, genetic makeup, and social support interact with the neurochemistry to produce such variation? Science can identify correlations, but causation is far harder to pin down. Another layer of mystery is the unpredictability of grief's return. Years may pass with the emotional load seemingly diminished, only for it to reappear suddenly. A scent, a song, or a location can trigger an acute reaction as if time itself had folded, bringing the past into the present. The brain had integrated the loss into its predictive model, yet remnants remain capable of reigniting the cascade of stress, inflammation, and emotional intensity. The very system designed to help us adapt, to learn from loss, can under certain conditions reintroduce it unexpectedly. Memory also plays a complex role. The brain does not simply erase the deceased or the lost experience. It integrates them into the structure of ongoing life. Grief is in part the tension between the desire to update the internal model to reflect reality and the persistence of the internal model that contains the lost connection. The two coexist, producing a dynamic state in which adaptation is gradual and nonlinear. Even when the intensity decreases, the traces of connection remain. They shape thoughts, reactions, and emotions in ways that are subtle but measurable. This leads to the realization that grief cannot be fully understood in isolation. It is the result of the interaction between multiple systems. Neural circuits, hormones, immune signaling, memory consolidation, and environmental feedback. Each system reacts according to its own rules, and their interactions produce emergent behaviors that are often surprising, sometimes overwhelming, and rarely linear. In other words, grief is not a single phenomenon that can be captured by one metric or explained by one theory. It is a process, a dynamic adaptation that spans mind, body, and experience. What is striking about this is that it challenges our intuition. Many people assume that grief should follow a predictable path, or that it can be solved or fixed in the way that physical injuries can be treated. But grief operates on a different scale. It is a long-term recalibration, one in which the brain and body are attempting to integrate the reality of absence, a reality that cannot be reversed, into a system that expects continuity and stability. Even the most precise tools of science, MRI scans, blood tests, sleep trackers, can only observe consequences, not fully capture the subjective essence. We can describe the structures, the chemical cascades, the behavioral patterns, But the phenomenological core, the lived experience of loss, remains elusive. This gap between observation and experience is one of the reasons grief is so difficult to explain, even as we increasingly understand its biological underpinnings. It is a reminder that some aspects of human existence, though measurable in effect, resist complete quantification. One of the most common misconceptions about grief is the idea that it simply goes away over time. People often speak of getting over it or moving on, but in reality, grief does not disappear in a neat, linear fashion. Instead, it changes form, gradually integrating into the fabric of daily life in ways that are subtle, uneven, and sometimes reversible. The process is less about erasing the memory or the emotional connection and more about adaptation, learning to live with a new version of reality that includes absence rather than presence. When someone is lost, the brain's predictive model, the internal representation of the world, has been profoundly disrupted. This model once included patterns, routines, and expectations involving the person who is gone. The model no longer aligns with external reality, creating persistent prediction errors. Over time, these errors decrease, but the original structure is not deleted. Instead, the system reorganizes. The person's absence becomes encoded as a new part of reality, gradually allowing predictions to adjust. The brain learns that the individual will not appear in the usual places, that calls will not come, and that interactions cannot be repeated. These updates reduce the intensity of error signals, but they do not erase the underlying connection that has been integrated over months or years. This integration is not instantaneous or uniform. Some moments, triggers, or memories can still produce acute responses, temporarily reigniting the cascade of stress, emotional intensity, and physiological reaction. Seeing a familiar location, hearing a particular voice, or encountering a sensory cue associated with the person can evoke the original pattern, demonstrating that the memory and attachment remain embedded in the system. In other words, grief leaves permanent traces. It does not vanish, it transforms. The loops of memory and prediction become less frequent and less intense, but remain accessible to the nervous system. The gradual recalibration also involves the body. Stress hormones and inflammatory markers, which were elevated during acute grief, slowly return toward baseline as the brain's predictive model stabilizes. Sleep patterns improve, energy levels normalize, and heart rate variability begins to recover. These physiological changes mirror the cognitive recalibration, showing that adaptation is a holistic process that spans both mind and body. Yet, because the system retains the memory of loss, it remains sensitive to triggers. The recalibration is not complete erasure, it is an accommodation. The body and brain are learning to function under new parameters, but the historical influence of the lost connection persists. This process highlights a fundamental truth: grief is not a problem to be solved, but a system to be understood. It is a measure of the depth of attachment, the intensity of integration into your neural and physiological networks. The persistence of memory, emotion, and bodily response is a signal that the lost person was deeply embedded in your lived experience. This perspective reframes grief. It is not merely suffering, it is evidence of the human capacity for connection, of the body's and brain's ability to encode relationships with remarkable fidelity. In essence, grief is adaptation without erasure. It is the brain's slow recalibration to a reality that cannot be undone, the body's adjustment to a missing regulatory influence, and the mind's ongoing negotiation with absence. It is uneven, sometimes unpredictable, and often paradoxical. The loops weaken, yet remain. The intensity decreases, yet can resurface. The memory integrates, yet never fully disappears. This illustrates that loss leaves an indelible mark, not as a flaw in the system, but as a testament to how intricately humans integrate relationships into the architecture of their minds and bodies.